Have you ever stopped to think that the way we learn something totally new, like maybe getting your hands messy with pottery, could actually tell us something fundamental about how we learn? Well, anything.
That's a fascinating thought, isn't it?
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into exactly that surprising link. We're looking at the connection between making pottery and this really interesting educational idea called learnography.
And we're doing it through the lens of motor science, basically, how our brains and bodies team up when we learn stuff.
Exactly. And our main guide here is an article by Shiva Narayan Takshila Page that draws this parallel.
Yeah, and what's cool right away is how this article paints learnography.
Mm.
It's not your typical sit and listen classroom setup.
No.
No, it really emphasizes, active hands-on learning. It's much more about doing things than just absorbing information passively.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive then is to figure out how this act of making a pot, which seems pretty straightforward on the surface,
hmm
can actually illuminate this whole learnography process, how we build knowledge, how we develop skills. It's like getting a fresh angle on effective learning.
And like you said, we're grounding this whole discussion in that specific article connecting the two.
Right. So let's jump into the core idea. The article basically says, well, like a potter shapes clay.
Right.
Learners in learnography are shaping these things called brain page modules.
Through active engagement, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great analogy to start with.
Definitely. So maybe let's unpack pottery first, just as this prime example of learning through doing, through motor skills.
Okay, the article lays out the basics.
Hmm.
You need clay, obviously, water, a wheel, different tools, and crucially, skilled hands.
It's not just thinking about a pot. It's a real physical, dynamic thing.
Absolutely. And if you break down the skills involved,
Mhm.
it screams motor learning. You've got hand-eye coordination, right? That
Mhm.
constant back and forth between seeing and adjusting.
Mhm.
Then the fine motor skills,
Mm.
tiny finger movements for shaping. And, maybe overlooked sometimes, patience. You gotta
Mhm.
stick with it.
Oh, for sure. Pottery doesn't happen overnight. And what about understanding the clay itself? The article mentions that too.
Yeah, getting that feel for is it too wet, too dry, is it ready? That's crucial. And the big techniques, like centering the clay on the wheel,
Which sounds fundamental.
totally, and then pulling up the walls, actually creating the form. That's a real skill.
And using the tools correctly, loop tools, ribs, sponges.
Exactly. Even how you sit, how you brace yourself, it all affects the outcome. It's very physical.
What really strikes me is that idea of it being muscle-driven and guided by constant feedback.
Mm.
You feel the clay wobble, you adjust.
Precisely. The article also touches on the emotional side, that immersive quality. You get invested in what you're making.
Yeah, that makes sense. That hands-on connection feels powerful. Okay, so how does this mirror learnography, this pottery of knowledge construction, as the article calls it?
Well, first, it's presented as a real contrast to, say, traditional education that might lean heavily on just listening to lectures.
Passive learning.
Right. Learnography sees the brain as active, always building, always processing, like the potter working the clay.
And just like the potter has tools and materials.
Learners do too. The article mentions books, tablets, models as tools maybe, and the syllabus, tasks, modules, that's the clay you're working with.
But the really interesting bit is this concept of motor training within learnography. What does that mean?
This is where it connects back so strongly to pottery. It means things like actually writing notes, drawing diagrams, maybe building a physical model, even rehearsing ideas out loud.
So not just reading or thinking, but doing something physical with the information.
Exactly. And that physical action helps create what the article calls brain page maps and modules. Think of them as the neural imprints, the structures you build in your brain through that active process.
Okay, I see. And the article draws direct parallels, point by point,
Yeah.
between the pottery skills and these learnography skills.
It does, yeah. It's quite detailed. Like hand-eye coordination in pottery. That's compared to, say, translating instructions or a diagram into your notebook, or maybe building a model based on it. You're actively moving information from one format to another.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Fine motor skills.
Yeah.
The delicate touch in pottery is linked to the precision needed for writing clear notes, working through math problems carefully, or drawing accurate diagrams.
Right.
And that patience and persistence we talked about in pottery.
Yeah.
In learnography, that shows up in things like cyclizide rehearsal, which sounds like structured, repeated practice over time,
Okay.
and miniature school practice.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe like creating small test scenarios to apply what you know, like practicing a tricky handle shape before putting it on the final pot.
I like that. And this one's interesting. Understanding the clay's properties.
It's like understanding the properties of knowledge itself
Yeah.
in learnography.
Yeah.
Its form, its function, how different pieces connect and can be applied.
It's about knowing the material you're working with, whether it's clay or concepts.
Exactly. Even centering the clay, that initial act of focus, is paralleled with centering your attention for deep understanding and learning.
Okay. And pulling up the walls, shaping the pot.
That's like layering complexity in your understanding, starting with basics and building up to more nuanced ideas, shaping the brain page, essentially.
And tool handling.
In learnography, that becomes using your knowledge tools, effectively maybe a compass, software, lab gear, whatever's relevant, applying them skillfully.
Got it. Even posture comes into it.
Yeah, the article links the potter's stable body position to good learning ergonomics, sitting properly, focusing your vision, comfortable writing posture. It all contributes.
So the big picture is moving from being a passive listener to an active knowledge potter.
Precisely. Crafting understanding through tasks, practice, feedback, self-direction.
So what's the common thread here? What ties shaping clay and shaping knowledge together?
Motor science. That's the core argument. It's about how our bodies and brains work together through these sensor-motor feedback loops.
Ah.
Whether you're feeling the clay respond or realizing a concept isn't clicking, your brain is processing sensory input and guiding your next action. The article mentions specific brain areas, the cerebellum for coordination, basal ganglia for habits, motor cortex for movement.
So it's deeply biological, this connection.
Very much so. And the article highlights shared processes that stem from this. First, this idea that movement actually drives learning. Physical interaction helps lock things into memory.
Right. Doing helps remembering.
Then, repetition refines skill.
Yep.
Practice makes perfect, essentially, in both domains.
Makes sense.
And feedback strengthens control. Mistakes aren't just failures. They're information you use to improve, whether it's fixing a wobbly pod or correcting a misunderstanding.
That feedback loop again.
Yeah, and sensory integration is key, using vision, touch, proprioception, your sense of body position, all guiding the outcome.
And that flow state, being in the zone.
Exactly. That emerges with mastery in both. That feeling of effortless action, deep immersion, and even joy.
So all this ties into this Takshila model of learnography.
Right. It reframes the classroom, not a teaching hall, but a brain page workshop.
A place for active construction.
Yeah, it fundamentally shifts the learner's role. You're not just receiving, you're building, like the potter getting hands-on, not just watching.
It really emphasizes that learning is doing.
Yeah.
And applying this motor science lens makes the pottery metaphor feel very grounded.
It does. Both pottery and learnography, viewed this way, need that physical engagement, the right setup, the task practice, adapting to feedback.
And even that emotional investment we talked about.
Right. So the principles that lead to mastery in a physical craft, like pottery active involvement, direct feedback, refining through practice, seem to mirror how our brains build knowledge best too.
It's striking to think about the outcome. In pottery, you get a tangible pot.
Something you can hold.
In learnography, you get this internal framework of knowledge. Less visible maybe, but incredibly powerful and adaptable.
Yeah, profound in its own way.
Which brings us back to that great line from the article, to mold knowledge is to mold clay, hands-on, heart-in, and brain-focused.
It's a powerful image. And the brain page becomes that clay pot of knowledge transfer, crafted through doing.
And this whole idea, it really pushes back against older models of education, doesn't it? The empty vessel idea where you just pour knowledge in.
Definitely. The article is pretty clear. True learning happens in motion.
So just like the potter learns by shaping the clay.
The student learns by actively shaping these brain page modules. It's empowering. It frames learning as creation, driven by purpose, precision, persistence, like a craftsperson.
It really makes you think. And for you listening, how does this whole comparison land? Does this idea of learnography as pottery resonate with your own learning experiences?
Yeah, have you found that when you're actively doing something, the learning sticks better?
What does it mean for you to view learning as an active process? What are the materials and tools you use to shape your understanding?
And think about that power of hands-on engagement. Does physically manipulating things or actively applying ideas make a difference for you when you're trying to master something new?
And could these principles from motor science movement, repetition, feedback apply to how you're learning right now? Could you incorporate more doing?
And finally, what about building knowledge in these modules? Does thinking about learning as this active, practice-driven, feedback-informed construction process spark any ideas for you?
So, wrapping this up, our deep dive really revealed this surprisingly strong analogy between pottery and learnography.
Yeah, grounded in odor science, showing how both rely on active physical participation and that constant feedback loop.
The key takeaway feels like, well, true understanding isn't just received, it's built
Mm.
through doing, through practice, through responding to feedback, like a potter working clay.
Exactly.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with, drawing from the article. Are we, collectively and individually, really embracing the science of doing in how we approach learning?
Are we creating environments where skillful hands can truly help build skillful minds?
Something to think about how you might bring more active, hands-on methods into your own quest for knowledge.
And if you want to explore this learnography idea further, the article points towards the Takshila page as a resource.